beginning, God created beast and man so that both might live in friendship. Evil men betrayed God's trust and waged bloody wars, not only against their own kind, but against the apes. Our Savior led a remnant of those who survived in search of greener pastures, where ape and human might forever live in friendship.
Welcome to Lawgiver, a Planet of the Apes podcast. Tonight I'm going to be looking at something that is very dear to my heart as a Planet of the Apes fan, and that is the multitude of Planet of the Apes comics that have been published over the years. This is just a whistle-stop tour because I'm going to do a couple of introductory episodes for people to get an idea of the kind of thing that I'm going to be looking at in the future. And then if you want to play along, then it gives you a bit of time to source those things. I'm calling this one the Planet of the Apes comic book checklist. And like I say, it'll give you an idea of what will be covered in the future. And maybe give you the opportunity to fill some gaps in your collection. But also, if you have no real intention of reading along, but just have a passing interest in Planet of the Apes comics, it'll give you an idea of what this part of our journey will be like. So the only things that I'm excluding at this point are things like the Japanese manga, there's a Hungarian comic, and a few other things like that I might come back to at some point in the future, but generally I'm going to be sticking to the American and British comics. And if you think that now you have to go out and buy a bunch of comics to be able to play along, well, actually, a large amount of the older ones are available online in Hunter's Planet of the Apes archive, and that is the definitive online archive for all things Planet of the Apes, and it's a site that I'll probably reference quite often. So in the American comic world, the journey began in 1970 with an adaptation of Beneath the Planet of the Apes by Gold Key Comics. And although I won't do most things chronologically, this probably will be the place that I begin. Now, Gold Key were one of the originators of the movie and television tie-in comic, with titles such as Star Trek, Lost in Space, and my personal favourite, The Twilight Zone. And they are notable for their beautiful painted covers, but the content itself could often feel pretty mass-produced and lightweight. For example, the stories in their Boris Karloff anthology comic were not really any different from the stories in their Twilight Zone anthology comic. And I guess as a symptom of the time, the stories were extremely simplistic. So we will take a deep dive on their brief dalliance with Planet of the Apes in the near future, because it didn't last long. And it was Marvel Comics who picked up the baton in 1974 for a 29-issue run that ended in 1977. And the great thing about the Marvel run is that it wasn't just comic stories, there were articles in there too. And the first issue even had an interview with Rod Serling, which is actually one of the most revealing interviews he ever did about Planet of the Apes. And while the Marvel series did do adaptations of some of the movies, it did some original stories too, all rendered in beautiful black and white artwork, and there have been some reprints of those since that we'll talk about in the future. The two adaptations of the first and second Planet of the Apes movies were reprinted from that original Marvel run in an 11-issue comic called Planet of the Apes Adventures. The difference here, though, is the stories were now colorized, and this 11-issue run has recently been reprinted in a hardback volume by Marvel Comics, but that's a topic that we'll come back to in the future. Now, I'm not a huge fan of comics adaptations of movies, tie-ins sure, because they tend to be different stories, but not adaptations of the movies themselves. They tend to just come off as truncated versions of the films, but that said, I think I just enjoy these Marvel issues for the art most of all, seeing what choices the artists make. For example, in these comics, Taylor doesn't look like Charlton Heston. It wasn't the era where people were going for dead-on likenesses of some of the characters, and it's things like that that I do find quite fascinating. But running alongside the 1974 Marvel US comic was a Marvel UK comic which was also called Planet of the Apes. And the Marvel UK comic was feeding a massive appetite for Planet of the Apes material in England at this time, because the American TV series was a huge hit in the UK, and Ape Mania was truly in force, and it lasted for several years. And the thing with the UK comic was, though, is that it was reprinting the US comic. So you might ask, why bother to cover both of them on the podcast? Well, here in the UK at the time, comics were generally released on a weekly basis, while in the US, they were monthly. So because they were coming out more often in the UK, they very quickly began to run out of material for their issues, because they were overtaking the US. Now, I'll get into this more when we cover it, but in those UK issues, they sometimes featured extra panels that the UK producers had begged Marvel US for. But also, there is the infamous extra strip, Ape Slayer. And Ape Slayer was a reprinted version of another US comic called Killraven. Now, Killraven was a kind of post-apocalyptic warrior, usually fighting for the freedom of the human race against aliens. So to create extra content for the UK market, they replaced the aliens' heads with apes' heads, and voila, more apes content. And there is a certain amount of charm to these giant-sized UK issues, and I'm looking forward to seeking out those differences between these and their US counterparts. But after the conclusion of the Marvel Comics Ape series, it was a fallow period for any new Apes material, all the way up to 1990, when Adventure Comics, which was a part of Malibu, picked up the license. Adventure Comics 2 was a company that dipped its toe into publishing movie-related material. They released comics on Logan's Run, Reanimator, and Alien Nation, and their particular Apes comics were apparently set after the time of Caesar in the movie timeline. And between 1990 and 1993, Adventure Comics released a regular series, some mini-series, and some one-shots, as well as a team-up you never asked for and never thought you would see, a team-up between Planet of the Apes and Alien Nation. And I have to say, I do have a certain fascination with these Adventure Comics issues. I own them all, but I haven't read any of them. But from a cursory glance through them, as a lifelong comics reader, it's hard not to notice that the artwork looks pretty amateurish. And if that's what the artwork is like, what's the writing going to be like? Well, I like to think that here on Lawgiver, everything gets the benefit of the doubt, so I will give these every chance. Because one thing I am impressed with is that they didn't just go with the obvious, telling more stories about Cornelius and Zira. They told stories about other places. What are the apes doing elsewhere? Are they living in different ways? So I'm actually very open to this era, although the fact that the apes were in the hands of a company that let books come out that look like this is perhaps a symptom of where Planet of the Apes was at that time. It was nowhere, it was in limbo, until of course the year 2001, when Tim Burton's movie came out and Dark Horse Comics took up the reins. Now, of course, we will get into the Tim Burton era, such as it was down the line, but there's nothing more fascinating to me than a comic series that's tying into a movie that became a bit of a franchise dead end. So when the movie series was dead on arrival, the comic tie-ins were also short-lived. But again, I'm looking forward to getting into these issues again. And it's perhaps another indication of how dead on arrival the Burtonverse was, that when Planet of the Apes returned to comics in 2005, they returned to the classic movie timeline when the now defunct comics company, Mr. Comics, released a 6-issue miniseries called Revolution on the Planet of the Apes. And this is one that I can't wait to return to. I have to show my hand a little early on this one because I love Revolution on the Planet of the Apes. Not only did it have a great main story, but there were side stories too, one of which brilliantly solves one of the inconsistencies in the original Planet of the Apes timeline. And while I own all of the issues in this series, I'm a bit more of a collected edition kind of guy. But sadly, because Mr. Comics seemed to have quickly died a death, their brilliant Planet of the Apes series appears to be stuck in limbo. But if you can get hold of the issues, I do recommend them, because these Mr. Comics issues were a kind of return to form for the Apes franchise in comics. And it was yet another comic book company who specialised in movie licenses that took up the mantle once more in 2011, and that was Boom Studios. This in a lot of ways is my favourite era of Planet of the Apes comics. Comics had grown up a lot by this point from the originals with Gold Key and Marvel, and Boom just released a multitude of titles again. So I'm not going to just read you a list of them here, but we will get to them all down the line. But they released an ongoing series set in the original Apes movies timeline. But by this point, the Apes were also coming back to life on screen. So as well as the classic era comics, Boom began publishing books in the timeline of the modern movies, created by Rupert Wyatt and then Matt Reeves. I'm not 100% sure what happened with the Boom Studios era, whether they just ran out of ideas or ran out of license. But in the latter days of their run, they seemed to be stuck in a bit of a cycle of releasing Planet of the Apes crossovers. There was Planet of the Apes and King Kong, Planet of the Apes and Green Lantern, and I do enjoy all of these issues a great deal. But there was also part of me that was just wondering, can't we just have a regular Planet of the Apes comic book series again? But I think the Boom years were good years, not least for Dana Gould's adaptation of Rod Serling's original script of Planet of the Apes. Well, I actually think it was the first couple of scripts considering the ending of that book, but again, that's a detail that we'll get into down the road. In recent years, with Disney's acquisition of Fox, the home of Planet of the Apes, it's perhaps no surprise that the comics license is now back in the hands of Marvel Comics, and a new ongoing Apes series has just begun, set in the modern Apes timeline. Now, I haven't quite decided how I'm going to cover those yet. I think I might do it as each arc finishes, rather than issue by issue. So watch this space for those. So this is just a brief whistle-stop tour of what's in store here on Lawgiver in the world of Planet of the Apes comics, and we will get into each of these things in a lot more detail, because these have been part of the fandom for almost as long as the movies themselves. And while they have been around when Ape Mania has been at its peak at various times, they've also been the thing that's kept the light burning during those periods when there was no Planet of the Apes to be found on the big screen. So I can't wait to return to this particular island on the Planet of the Apes, and I hope you'll join me. Bye for now.
We still wait, my children. But as I look at apes and humans, living in friendship, harmony, and peace. Now, some 600 years after Caesar's death, at least we wait with hope for the future.